I had committed my husband to the earth 4 years prior. Standing beneath gray skies that felt like punishment, holding my young son's trembling hand, I had spoken the words that would reshape our entire existence. His father would not be returning. I had believed them absolutely. Upon that belief, I constructed a life, smaller in circumference, quieter in nature, but unmistakably mine. That existence held firm until a Tuesday afternoon suspended somewhere above Colorado, when my 9-year-old glanced sideways and drained the color entirely from his face. 4 words escaped his lips, each one detonating against everything I thought I understood about my world. "Mom, Dad's back there." I laughed initially, dismissing it as the hyperactive imagination of a child nervous about flying. "Impossible," I assured him. "Absolutely impossible." Then I rotated in my seat. My attention caught upon a wrist I recognized, the silver band catching afternoon light in a pattern I had memorized across 1,000 mornings. My lungs ceased their work. The holiday had been Ethan's inspiration, or perhaps mine transformed into his desire through the alchemy only a parent understands. Regardless, it had taken 4 years of persuasion before I agreed to it. Our first genuine escape since Christian vanished. 5 days by the Gulf, just the two of us. I had selected a resort with a pool carved into the silhouette of a starfish precisely because Ethan had pointed without hesitation and declared, "That one." Something fractured open within me at witnessing him want anything again. Relief had flooded through cracks I hadn't recognized existed. We were queuing to board when he became unusually still. I noticed with the vigilance reserved for people monitoring wounds, watching to see if they'd begun bleeding again. He stared past my shoulder into the line behind us. I followed his gaze into a crowd of anonymous travelers, their luggage identical, their expressions vacant with airport fatigue. A woman absorbed by her telephone. A man in charcoal gray, his back toward us. He nodded too quickly, the kind of affirmation that acknowledges nothing. I released the moment. Children grow strange at airports. The stimulation proves overwhelming. The crowd feels suffocating. Strangers become threatening. I cycled through these rationalizations all the way down the bridge, all the way to seats C and 14D, which we had selected together from a digital map 2 weeks earlier, Ethan's finger tracing an invisible line like solving a puzzle. We settled into the narrow space. I fastened his seatbelt despite his newfound ability to manage it himself. Some rituals persist long after their necessity. The aircraft began its crawl toward the runway. Ethan held the armrest with whitened knuckles. When I pressed him for information, his voice emerged lower still, as though volume might transform whisper into reality. I turned before rational thought could stop me. I offered myself the excuse that I was proving him wrong, demonstrating that strangers were simply strangers, that his imagination had constructed a phantom, that nothing existed but empty fears. There was a man 2 rows distant, aisle seat, a novel unopened upon his lap. Sandy hair threaded with gray at the temples in a configuration I recognized before permitting myself to recognize it. Shoulders curved inward in that particular posture of a man attempting to occupy minimal space. My digestive system performed a peculiar descent before my consciousness caught up. Then I observed his left hand resting against the armrest, a wedding band, his thumb rotating against it in small, unconscious arcs, thinking about something he wanted to avoid thinking about. This gesture belonged to my memory, Christian at our kitchen table whilst managing our taxes, at the hospital entrance the night Ethan arrived. I forced my body forward. My hands trembled with sufficient violence to require pressing them flat against my thighs. I constructed a narrative, grief manipulating perception, the mind's cruel capacity to sculpt familiar features from anonymous material. A stranger's jawline, unfamiliar hands, 4 years of longing funneled into the wrong body. I maintained this story for 3 hours, whilst Ethan beside me remained rigid and silent, occasionally whispering fragments I refused to hear. He murmured observations I didn't want confirmed. That man looked directly at Ethan during boarding before averting his eyes with deliberate speed. I maintained my forward gaze. I concentrated upon the seat ahead, the little illuminated monitor depicting our trajectory across a continental map. I thought about the flag they had presented to me, folded into precise angles, containing nothing beneath it except formal apology. The Coast Guard had not recovered his body from 60 meters of main water. I considered 4 years of celebrations marked for 2, holidays observed in absence, Tuesday evenings setting tables that were untouched. I had spent those years constructing absolute certainty of his absence because the alternative, that he might have selected departure, represented a wound I couldn't endure twice. The aircraft began descending. Pressure changed in my ears. Ethan reached over and seized my hand. His fingers possessed the temperature of someone freezing. Landing touched us with gentleness. The cabin brightened as passengers mobilized themselves, reaching, gathering, murmuring with the particular relief of arrival. I remained stationary for as long as conceivable, but inevitably the aisle emptied, and the man too rose distant, stood, and rotated. For a single suspended second, across the width of a metal tube hurtling through sky and time, we locked eyes. It was unmistakably Christian. Older, diminished, weathered in ways 4 years and an alternative life inscribe upon faces. Yet this remained his face, the one I had memorized in hospital corridors, kissed during countless ordinary mornings, grieved until grief constituted my entire identity. My husband existed, breathing, ambulatory, positioned 2 rows away, regarding me as though I represented something spectral. I did not scream. I did not propel myself forward. Something primal held my body in stillness, arranged my expression into plausible confusion, whilst everything composed of survival instincts screamed silently from within. Christian averted his attention first. He extracted a duffel from the overhead compartment, murmured something indecipherable to a woman I hadn't previously registered. Blonde, approximately mid-30s, sunglasses anchored in her hair, then proceeded up the aisle without backward glance. Ethan's grip intensified until pain registered. That was him, wasn't it, Mum? That was really him. I articulated the only verifiable statement I possessed. I don't yet know, darling, but we're going to discover the truth. We retrieved our belongings in a dreamlike state. Baggage claim existed as autopilot navigation, scanning faces, gray jackets, shoulders that might attach to deceased persons. I glimpsed him once more near the rental counters, the blonde woman's hand secured through his arm, both of them laughing at something uncomplicated and unhurried, like people without schedules or secrets. The ordinariness devastated more than shock. My husband had perished with such credibility that I had engineered funerals, selected headstones, constructed life narratives around his negation. And here he materialized, laughing in an airport 4 years hence, tanned and viable, cradling another woman's hand like it naturally belonged there. I didn't approach him directly. Every instinct demanded confrontation. But something colder materialized beneath the terror, the identical instinct that had carried me through memorial services, insurance documentation, the subsequent year of learning silence. I required intelligence before demanding explanation. So I pursued him cautiously, whilst Ethan's hand remained locked in mine. They boarded a shuttle bearing the resort's insignia. I examined the logo against my confirmation email still illuminated on my telephone screen. It was identical, the precise resort I had selected 8 weeks prior because my son had targeted a starfish-shaped pool without hesitation. Coincidence of that magnitude does not occur through accident. Either someone anticipated our arrival or something stranger operated at work. Both possibilities terrified me more than witnessing his face. I contacted Daniel Ross from a taxi, my voice foreign in my own ears. Daniel had served as our family's legal counsel for 12 years, had remained beside me during the entire procedure of having Christian declared legitimately deceased, had literally held my hand the day the settlement processed. I explained what I'd observed. Silence extended across the line, substantial enough to suggest disconnection. "Julia," he finally said, "if that's truly Christian, you must comprehend what you're describing. Insurance fraud. A man permitting official death certificates issued in his name." He paused meaningfully. "That constitutes criminal activity, and you've inadvertently profited from it." I hadn't conceptualized the situation that way. I had only viewed him as my husband dead, then inexplicably living. I hadn't considered the $240,000 secured in Ethan's educational trust, the policy permitting our home's retention, every dollar constructed upon deception I hadn't known I inhabited. "Don't confront him," Daniel instructed. "Don't communicate with anyone at that resort. Observe and contact me if anything alters. I'm investigating several matters independently. That evening, once Ethan had cried himself into exhausted unconsciousness in an adjacent room, I positioned myself on my balcony with illumination extinguished. Voices carried oddly across the courtyard architecture, 2 floors below, 3 doors distant. I recognized a cadence instantly: Eve. And now, even following everything, that particular tone he employed when attempting to soothe someone, words remained inaudible. I required none. Doubt had been entirely eliminated. I remained motionless in darkness, rotating my wedding band with my thumb, the one I maintained despite claiming it was mere habit. I contemplated the woman who had knelt above an empty casket, releasing earth onto closed wood. How would she receive this knowledge? That the man she had mourned possessed laughter, operated a rental vehicle, carried another woman's hand, and had simply determined not to return home. Around midnight, footsteps resonated along the walkway below. Against better judgment, I inclined toward the railing and observed downward. Christian stood solitary near the pool, mostly obscured from view, telephone at his ear, voice insufficiently audible. Then, as though ancient instinct communicated he was being observed, his head elevated. Our eyes converged for the second occurrence that day. This time he maintained contact. 3 seconds extended between us, duration enough for unnamed communication to traverse space. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite warning. Then he rotated and walked quickly interior, a man recognizing he'd been discovered. Morning brought comprehension that restructured everything. Christian hadn't seemed surprised encountering me. That balcony moment confirmed it. A man genuinely believing he'd intersected with his supposedly deceased wife through pure chance does not simply glance upward, hold gaze, and withdraw like sealing a door. He responds with panic. He pursues. He freezes entirely. Christian executed none of those reactions. He observed me as someone regards an expected problem finally arriving. I hadn't slept. Early hours involved rotating that recognition repeatedly. Once Ethan awakened, I'd manufactured a resolution. I wouldn't ascend to the pool demanding clarification. I would determine precisely what I confronted before revealing existing knowledge. I deposited Ethan at the kids' program, watching him run toward other children temporarily unburdened, and approached the reception desk with manufactured inquiry concerning billing discrepancies. Modest deceptions encourage hospitality workers toward communication. I described Christian carefully, omitting his name. The receptionist, demonstrating helpfulness, retrieved a reservation and rotated the screen before catching himself. The registered name was not Christian Price. It was Christopher Reyes. I manufactured gratitude and departed, though trembling didn't cease until my door was secured. A person doesn't accidentally acquire separate first and last names. That requires genuine passport. That necessitates years of deliberate construction. I rented transportation that afternoon under auspices of viewing coastline, but instead I watched. I'm not particularly proud of how naturally I collapsed into it, parking distantly, sunglasses, feigned reading whilst cataloging every person entering and exiting the lobby. Grief had taught me patience. Apparently, it had additionally taught me invisibility. I observed Vanessa. I'd heard Christian articulate her name once, softly, across the pool deck. I watched her laugh at telephone notifications whilst Christian sat quiet beside her, assessing crowds like someone accustomed to identifying exits. I followed them in a rented sedan 20 minutes inland to an unremarkable strip mall diner, the sort tourists never locate. Vanessa remained vehicled. Christian entered alone, positioning himself across from a distinguished gentleman I didn't recognize. Silver hair, formal attire, a leather portfolio positioned precisely upon the table like a stage prop from a frequently rehearsed performance. I couldn't position myself closely enough to capture everything. I sat 2 booths distant, telephone propped against a napkin container, recording, and hoping ambient noise wouldn't obliterate every utterance. Most of it did, but fragments persisted. The insurance won't reopen if nobody documents are clean, Christopher. I made certain she can never know the account exists. I remained motionless through remaining conversation, incapable of consuming the food serving as camouflage, observing my supposedly deceased husband nod, along to strangers' instructions regarding documents and accounts and information I apparently was never meant to comprehend. That evening, I transmitted the recording and everything I'd discovered to Daniel. He contacted me within an hour, his voice stripped of careful legal composure. Julia, I investigated Christopher Reyes exhaustively. Social security documentation exists. Driver's identification was issued 3 years prior in Nevada. Credit history extends backward to precisely the moment Christian's death certificate was registered. He paused. I additionally verified Christian Price's death certificate. It maintains validity. As far as Maine's government registers, why? Our husband remains deceased 4 years hence, so which exists as reality. That's what disturbs me, Daniel articulated, because both apparently do. 2 complete identities. 2 comprehensive documented existences. Single face. I contemplated the man in the diner booth sliding that portfolio across the table with practiced composure, someone who'd executed this performance repeatedly. I contemplated the words insurance and documentation and can't ever know, and about a woman waiting patiently in a parked automobile, completely ignorant. Don't perform anything, Daniel cautioned. Don't approach him. Contact me every hour, and if anything modifies even marginally, contact me before doing anything else. I assured him. I meant it when I said it. But that evening, wakeful in a hotel room 2 levels above a man who had deceived the entire world regarding his drowning, I recognized that observing from distance would no longer suffice. Whatever Christian had transformed into, he no longer constituted someone I could simply monitor from a balcony and await understanding. I chose to communicate with Vanessa subsequent morning, though I convinced myself against it repeatedly beforehand. I instructed myself it was reckless, that Daniel had specifically cautioned against precisely this approach. But I continued contemplating her waiting, patiently exterior to that diner, unaware what her companion had just transferred to a stranger. Whatever he'd become, she hadn't selected this. She warranted at minimum someone prepared to acknowledge her directly. I discovered her poolside unaccompanied, Christian elsewhere pursuing mysterious obligations. I seated myself nearby and initiated the conversation strangers conduct at resorts, regarding overpriced beverages, regarding afternoon heat and optimal swimming locations. She proved easy to engage, warmer than anticipated, laughter arriving naturally and without guardedness. I despised how thoroughly I appreciated her within moments. She mentioned her companion eventually, as content individuals do when seeking excuse for discussion. 2 years together. She articulated that he'd explained being a widower without offspring. He'd specified explicitly that he and his previous spouse had never produced children, that this constituted one quiet grief of his initial marriage. He'd communicated he'd relocated westward to distance himself from previous memories. I maintained composure and posed gentle follow-up inquiries that encouraged elaboration rather than suspicion. She displayed telephone photographs unprompted, proud in the effortless manner of emerging romance. Christian on a hiking path. Christian operating a kitchen I recognized instantly as one that wasn't ours. Christian laughing at something beyond the camera's scope. Then one more mature photograph from some anniversary dinner. His left hand positioned on the table, and even diminished on a telephone screen I could observe it. He wore his wedding band. Turned inward, the surface confronting his palm. Easily overlooked unless you understood precisely what to search for. I understood precisely. Something in my thorax fractured unexpectedly. Not relief, not vindication. Something resembling fresh, unfamiliar grief. For a species of devotion I couldn't rationalize. A man does not inadvertently maintain his wedding band turned inward whilst building an entirely separate existence with someone else. That represents not carelessness. That constitutes a decision performed every morning. Remember what he had abandoned. I excused myself before Vanessa could observe my hands trembling. I articulated that our encounter had been lovely, and I meant it, and that truthfulness unsettled me more than most everything else since the airport. That evening, returning Ethan from the kids' program, Christian encountered me. Not coincidentally, I now comprehended. Nothing concerning this man's movements near me had ever been unintentional. He materialized beside a palm arrangement along the pathway, and Ethan stopped mid-stride, observing his father with expression I couldn't categorize. Christian observed me initially, not Ethan. 4 years compressed into a single terrible absence. Then he articulated the single thing he seemed capable of managing. Please not here. I wanted to scream. I wanted every answer simultaneously. What narrative did he construct in 4 years permitting his son's maturation without paternal presence? Instead, I discovered myself simply consenting because my son stood adjacent, small and rigid, observing his father with raw, unshielded hope that demolished something inside me. Christian's attention shifted to Ethan ultimately, and something crossed his features, pain undeniably authentic, before he propelled himself to depart. Ethan didn't cry until we were back in our room. He posed questions I lacked answers for. Why wouldn't father embrace me? Why did he appear anguished? Will he come home now? I held my son and provided the remaining honest statement I possessed. I don't yet know, darling, but I promise I'll discover the truth. Subsequently, once Ethan had drifted off, I ventured onto the balcony and recognized something I hadn't previously. A man in dark clothing stationed at the courtyard's far extremity, motionless, phonelessly, simply observing the building. Specifically, I comprehended with spreading chill the section where Christian's room was positioned. I had imagined I was the singular hunter pursuing truth. Standing there in darkness, I recognized I might not be the singular observer monitoring Christian Price. And if that held accuracy, whatever he'd escaped from 4 years prior might not have concluded with him yet. Christian entered my room just after midnight. I almost declined opening the door. Every instinct demanded contacting Daniel initially, adhering to protocol, maintaining solitude with a person I no longer comprehended. Yet I opened it regardless, because some element required hearing whatever needed articulation more than I required caution. He didn't attempt embrace. He didn't apologize initially as I'd constructed in darker hours. He positioned himself in my doorway, appearing more senior than his years, and articulated the singular thing that mattered. Everything you believe concerning what transpired with me is only partially true. I permitted him entry. I seated myself at the window's modest table, arms folded, and directed him toward communication without cessation until comprehension arrived. He articulated a narrative concerning someone designated Aldrich Voss, a name entirely unfamiliar. A business partner in a shipping logistics operation, Christian had quietly financed the year preceding his disappearance. He described discovering that the operation functioned as camouflage financial documentation that didn't correspond with legitimate business, capital moving via accounts that existed exclusively on documents, circulating in configurations that produced coherence exclusively if assuming declared cargo differed substantially from actual cargo. He described attempting authorities contact discreetly and experiencing threats within a week, not explicitly articulated, but comprehended completely. They mentioned Ethan's institution. They mentioned my commute. That transmitted the complete message. He articulated details concerning the fishing excursion, not precisely accident, but manufactured opportunity emerging from desperation. A boat overturning deliberately in waters notorious for powerful currents. A life preservation positioned for discovery. A body that would never surface because no body had ever existed. He articulated it represented his solely conceived approach to eliminating our danger without traversing the catastrophe ourselves. I couldn't entirely believe him. Grief doesn't undo itself simply because someone hands you a narrative matching grief's contours. If that holds accuracy, I articulated, why didn't you return once safety existed? Why did I encounter 4 years of silence and a Vanessa who imagines you buried someone never existing? He delayed responding. When he finally articulated, his voice had roughened in ways I remembered from our marriage's worst periods, nights when something in him closed entirely because he couldn't determine when safety would arrive. Every year that elapsed, return became less imaginable. Not increasingly. I convinced myself I was safeguarding you through continued absence. I'm no longer certain how much constituted truth and how much represented simply easier than confronting what I'd perpetrated against you both. He transmitted a drive, something fitting into a coat pocket, alongside a handwritten page containing names and numerical sequences. He articulated it represented everything, Aldrich Voss's network, documentation assembled across years while he remained shadowed. He articulated it provided proof, if I required it, that his disappearance had materialized from authentic justification. I contacted Daniel the moment Christian departed. He procured the drive subsequent morning wordlessly, disappearing with his laptop for nearly 3 hours. When he re-emerged, his expression possessed that particular stillness of someone maintaining professional composure. It's legitimate, Julia. The accounts, the designations, the transfer configurations, everything aligns with publicly available shipping and customs documentation. Whatever this operation represented, it existed genuinely, and it proved serious enough that governmental organizations wanted participation. I should have experienced relief. Instead, something colder settled into my core. Facts clarified why he had vanished. They didn't clarify why he'd permitted his son's initial steps, first dental loss, literacy education, and maturation into a boy who'd stood frozen on a pathway, all without single communication from the father observing from control. De-distance the entire duration. I posed that question directly subsequently, and he possessed no sufficient answer. He simply articulated apology in the flattened, depleted voice of someone who'd exhausted superior vocabulary. That evening, positioned at my window, I observed a black automobile entering the resort's vehicular approach with official character that contracted my digestive system before I witnessed the gentleman exiting it. Substantial, formally dressed, progressing with the unhurried assurance of someone whose presence required no explanation. He proceeded directly to reception and demonstrated something I couldn't perceive from that distance, but I recognized the movement, identification, or the civilian equivalent. Daniel's previous declaration abruptly returned. If Christian genuinely existed, everything concerning his death transformed into criminal activity. Someone besides ourselves had finally noticed that a deceased individual remained decidedly alive. That gentleman introduced himself subsequent morning at my entrance as Marcus Hale, investigator for the insurance organization that had dispersed Christian's death benefit 4 years prior. He transmitted courtesy in the rehearsed manner of someone who delivered terrible information repeatedly, and he manufactured no attempt at softening his purpose. Routine information matching, he articulated, had flagged passport reentry designated Christopher Reyes with biometric markers sufficiently resembling Christian Price's previous driver's photograph to warrant examination. My designation on the initial claim had directed him immediately toward my residence. I didn't fabricate narrative. I lacked sufficient vitality for deception. I articulated what I comprehended, though I withheld the drive Christian had transmitted, the designations, the comprehensive Aldrich Voss details. That information belonged to Daniel until we recognized precisely what required protection and from whom. Marcus absorbed without substantial reaction, documented in his leather notebook, and articulated that the insurance organization would be commencing fraud examination regardless. He articulated it courteously. It didn't decrease the word's impact. I confronted Christian that afternoon, and finally I posed the inquiry I'd been most apprehensive of articulating. Had he employed the currency? That $240,000 confined within Ethan's account, constructed on his death's fabrication. He appeared nearly insulted at needing to reply. He articulated he hadn't expended a single unit, hadn't approached it, had deliberately designed his disappearance so that account remained untouched, a peculiar, distorted integrity interred within a monumental betrayal. Daniel verified it within the hour. Every monetary unit remained precisely where left, generating accumulated interest, unclaimed by the person who might have acquired it, and disappeared far more comfortably than strip mall diner meetings. Then what? I posed, positioned beside him on a bench near the resort's abandoned tennis installations, the ocean tumultuous and indifferent behind us. Why didn't you return the moment you recognized safety existed? You're describing someone observing us. You understood Ethan's institution. You understood when I transitioned employment. That doesn't characterize a man fleeing danger. That describes someone selecting continued distance. He remained silent substantially before responding. When he did, his voice lacked the rehearsed composure from preceding conversations. It fractured in locations not fractured in years, not since our early matrimony when he still permitted observable suffering. Because every year I remained absent, I convinced myself you'd constructed something better without me, that I'd simply ruin returning to it. And the longer I performed that narrative, the increasingly valid it manifested, despite some segment perpetually comprehending, it simply represented the simplest way of continuing invisibility from what I genuinely perpetrated against you both. I didn't cry from fury, not in that instance. I cried unexpectedly because I comprehended something concerning this man that investigation could never have demonstrated. Whatever safeguarding he imagined providing, he had additionally been enduring a punishment of his manufacture. For years observing beyond a life he wasn't permitted to enter. For years knowing his son's institution and his spouse's employment, and never once being capable of entering the threshold and simply remaining there. He hadn't accomplished escape. He had constructed himself another variety of confinement and voluntarily inhabited it, and articulated it constituted affection. It didn't exonerate him. I require clarity regarding that, even presently. Grief and forgiveness don't constitute identical currents, and I wasn't prepared permitting one transport me toward the other. Yet something within me softened toward his sufferings. Configuration, even whilst remaining furious regarding the years he'd appropriated from Ethan. That evening, Marcus returned, this moment bearing his own documentation, and the conversation proceeded in directions none of us had anticipated. The financial mechanism Christian had escaped, Aldrich Voss's operation, had drawn substantially greater federal examination across preceding 2 years than Christian himself had comprehended while concealing from it. Marcus articulated investigators had already constructed most of a governmental case, utilizing entirely independent methodologies. What they previously lacked represented a witness, prepared to articulate how the operation had explicitly threatened a civilian into manufacturing his disappearance to maintain silence. Your husband, Marcus articulated, selecting that designation deliberately, monitoring my expression, wasn't the operation's architect. He constituted leverage. Somebody manipulated him to maintain a far larger operation's quiet, and whoever engineered the scheme producing his disappearance's apparent credibility represents the person we genuinely pursue. I contemplated that substantially, revolving it. Christian wasn't this narrative's villain ultimately. Not precisely. He'd been a frightened, imperfect individual who'd manufactured an unforgivable determination for authentically existing justifications. Yet someone else, someone remaining unidentified, still circulating, had constructed the apparatus permitting his vanishing's possibility. And that individual had never confronted consequence regarding 4 years my son's maturation, without paternal presence. Arrests materialized 3 weeks subsequently, once we'd all returned to permanent residence, and the resort had transformed into someplace I never wanted revisiting. Marcus contacted Daniel initially, and Daniel contacted me. Within singular conversation, I comprehended Aldrich Voss and 2 associates had been taken into federal custody on designations spanning capital laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy, documentation reaching backward years preceding Christian's involvement. The documentation Christian had transmitted in a hotel chamber, the drive I'd carried homeward in my coat like something radioactive, had transformed into a single component of a vastly more comprehensive case the federal government had already been quietly assembling. Christian was never prosecuted regarding anything connecting to Voss's operation. Investigators made that explicit and emphasized crediting his participation. Yet manufacturing his disappearance, registering falsified documentation, and existing under fabricated designation for 4 years constituted criminal activity, regardless of the sympathetic justifications behind them. He personally surrendered subsequent week, ambulating into a federal construction in formal attire that produced stranger appearance, and I positioned myself in the corridor with Ethan's hand maintained with mine, whilst legal consultants employed terminology resembling restitution and participation agreement in ways signifying very little to a 9-year-old, interested simply in whether his father faced endless incarceration. He wasn't. The magistrate, counterbalancing 4 years of self-imposed isolation against someone who'd ultimately demolished a criminal operation rather than profiting from it, administered probation and numerous community obligation hours. Supplemented with formatted reimbursement plan, for the insurance disbursement, the organization had already quietly determined not to totally demand given circumstances. It wasn't righteous in any uncomplicated manner. It simply represented law's available configuration. Vanessa departed prior to hearing completion. I learned secondarily that she'd relocated toward Ohio, her siblings' proximity, and hadn't communicated with Christian following the moment truth fragmented her world. I contemplated her occasionally in subsequent months, a woman who'd experienced romance with someone constructed entirely from fabrication, who'd lost years to a connection that never possessed legitimate designation. I trusted that wherever she was, she discovered her path toward authenticity. Christian requested occasion with Ethan before his preliminary community obligation, and I consented. Despite everything within me still hesitating, I informed myself it wasn't for Christian. It was for my son, who warranted expressing whatever he required to the father he'd spent 4 years imagining deceased, and one strange, disorienting moment learning lived. The gathering transpired within my living room of every locations, the single most ordinary configuration for the strangest conversation comprising our complete experiences. Christian descended to Ethan's height, something he'd formerly executed naturally when Ethan was younger, and I observed years of practice come back into his physicality despite everything transforming. He didn't pursue embrace. He didn't require one. I wasn't there, he articulated, and his voice fractured in ways I'd never previously experienced across 12 matrimonial years. Ethan examined him for duration extended beyond comfort, that unflinching observation sole children seem capable of delivering. And subsequently he articulated the phrase that dismantled something within us simultaneously. I've already learned existing without you. No tears materialized from Ethan. Merely a kind of calm, clear truthfulness that transmitted my son had transformed into someone possessing greater resilience and discernment than either parental had accomplished. Christian openly wept, positioned on my living chamber flooring, and I positioned myself in the entrance and permitted him, because it wasn't my responsibility softening that moment. He had earned all of it. We didn't restore our relationship. I require expressing that explicitly because I imagine it matters, and because it characterizes the completion our narrative genuinely warranted rather than the one simpler narrative might have provided. Christian moved into a modest apartment across the metropolitan area, sufficiently near to accommodate his community obligation and Ethan interactions, sufficiently removed that our existences didn't randomly converge. We transformed into something neither possessed nomenclature for. Not strangers. Not couple. Merely two individuals permanently connected by a boy loving us both, and by a reality we'd each needed to learn carrying differently. Occasional evenings, observing Ethan position the table for 3 of us on Christian's supper visits, I contemplate the woman I was on that conveyance, convinced I was disintegrating mentally, convinced that suffering had ultimately shattered something irreplaceable. I contemplate how significantly simpler it would have manifested if he'd genuinely perished in that water encounter. If the narrative had genuinely completed the manner, I'd entombed it 4 years before. Yet simplicity had never characterized reality, and I've ceased desiring the version of this which would have proven easier elucidating at community gatherings. 4 years prior, I entombed the person I loved because I imagined he'd passed. This occasion, I entombed the life we could never reconstruct, not with suffering, but with something resembling acceptance. Christians survived the ocean. Our matrimony didn't, and somehow recognizing that wounded less than dwelling within deception perpetually had.